Welcome to Two Millennials and Mom, where we bring you engaging conversations and respectful disagreement across the social spectrum.
Injected with the quirks of everyday life.
Curl up as we navigate the complexities of this modern world with all the humor and warmth we can muster.
And the occasional gentle ribbing. We're glad you're here. Happy listening.
Hey. Welcome to Two Millennials and Mom. I'm Callie.
I'm Cole.
I'm Mom.
How are y'all?
Good.
Doing pretty
ready
good.
to dive into this one.
Yeah, definitely ready for this episode. Still trying to become a person today.
I get it. So, Cole, what are we diving into today?
Well, today we're diving into the ever-blurring lines between fact, truth, and media bias. From the golden age of Edward R. Murrow to today's clickbait chaos, why is public trust in journalism at an all-time low? And is it even possible to be unbiased in 2025? How has the media's role in society changed? And what's the difference between reporting facts and telling the truth?
So here a few weeks ago, CNN aired the live Broadway show, Good Night and Good Luck, that was originally a movie in 2005?
Mm-hmm.
George Clooney's in both of them, the movie and the play. And so
in different roles.
Yes.
Yeah.
So Mom and I saw somewhere that it was going to be airing. And so we sat down to watch the play when they aired it. And I haven't found that it is airing again. Like there's no putting it out there somewhere else.
Yeah. I haven't seen a recording or anything that it's coming back. It was the first time that's ever happened. And then they had a pretty big group of journalists follow up afterwards. And then an interview with 60 Minutes Scott Pelley after that, which I really liked listening to also. And then Cole and I watched the movie yesterday. You can catch it on streaming for your $4 kind of deal. And so we watched it. And I would say that the movie paralleled the Broadway show in many ways, in a lot of ways. I kind of felt like I got more from the movie, more depth out of the movie. And that's probably just because you weren't limited to a stage to produce all of that on. Yeah. But I was fascinated by the fact that they used real-time clips from that period. Like when McCarthy responded to Murrow, they used the actual clip. There's a part in there about a guy in the Air Force that had been dismissed or was being dismissed from the Air Force because his father read a Serbian newspaper, and that made him trustworthy, even though he'd spent, 20 years in the Air Force. And they used that clip of him and his sister both in both of these. And so it was really a fascinating, the movie also was all black and white, which in 2005 just seemed really unheard of, but was all black and white. So it really gave you that nostalgic feel for all of it. And it was just a really interesting. I had not delved into McCarthyism or why. I've looked a little bit more at McCarthy, and I just am shaking my head thinking, I mean, he wasn't a nice man ever. And so you just kind of think.
I feel like we need to offer a little bit of context as to what we're talking about here.
Well, that's probably true.
In the 50s, there was a junior senator from Wisconsin, Joe McCarthy. Joe McCarthy is infamous in American history, if you will, during a time that is often referred to as the Red Scare. America in the 50s we're really just starting to heat up our competition with communist leadership on the other side of the planet, primarily with Russia at this point, but also with China at the time. And Senator McCarthy has essentially gone about and come up with a witch hunt, particularly through the State Department, if I recall correctly, but really just kind of more broadly across U.S. government employment in general, but American citizens with accusations of being communists or being spies for communists, and
having
oftentimes
infiltrated the government.
And oftentimes with relatively little to no evidence, working primarily on hearsay in a lot of these instances.
Which is kind of a routine trait of a witch hunt, but
yeah.
Fair.
But I mean, there's a part in there where he's gone after, he's stating that, 200 and some odd state employees are communists. And yet when it comes down, and he misquotes himself. I mean, he goes from 284 to 57. But it's on this little tidbit of information that he just goes crazy with and states things about that he has no backing for.
Well, he really starts to exploit America's fear of communism for personal popularity gain, essentially.
Well, and then the story of Good Night and Good Luck is set during that time, during the 90s, when the rise of McCarthyism is really kind of taking hold and this witch hunt and everything is happening. And so the movie and the play both follow Edward R. Murrow, who's a broadcast journalist for CBS, and his news team as they're risking their careers to expose all of these fear-driven tactics of this junior senator from Wisconsin. So the play is exploring the power of the press, the cost of truth-telling, and the role of media in a democracy under pressure. So Murrow's perspective remains a powerful reminder that journalism isn't just about reporting facts. At its core, it's about the responsibility of the press, the cost of speaking out, and the enduring relevance of his own words, which he says, we cannot defend freedom abroad by deserting it at home. So I think that that's so poignant, especially today. I mean, I feel like it's so relevant in what we're watching happen within our government today. And then you kind of bring in the media of it and the bias of it all. And so in this play, which is all based on real life, but in this play and in this movie, you watch them struggling with the network heads and saying, hey, this is going to cost us money. This is going to cost us viewers. We're not willing to do that. I get that it's the truth. Okay, yeah. You have a short leash here. You can go, but this is all still very much in the middle of the fairness doctrine, where Edward R. Murrow and his team are coming out saying X, Y, and Z, but they have to give equal time to the opposite, to the opposition of that. And so they pull McCarthy onto their show and say, hey, we're talking bad about you. Please come present your side. Come present your side. And that's where it kind of goes into what Mom was talking about, how they're saying, look, we're showing you his words and what he has said and how these things are being represented. You can make that call for yourself, but we're worried about this. And then McCarthy comes on, and there's some weird kind of stipulations that were strange for the time and wouldn't be super weird today. But he comes in and he doesn't really have any kind of rebuttal.
No, he just attacks Murrow. You were part of this. You were part of the IWW, and you've done this for 20 years. And you had this book that was dedicated to you, and this guy is a known socialist. And just, accusation after accusation, even though he doesn't address what
any
they've
of
said
the attacks
to him.
against him.
Yes. And I was impressed that in real life, Murrow responded to that. He didn't go
rather eloquently, if the movie is.
He didn't attack, but he just went, okay.
You're right. This book is dedicated to me. This is the relationship that I had with that author. I didn't know that this was going on. And this is who that person was. And you can make up your own mind and make your own determination on whether you think that that was right or wrong, or whether you want to hold me accountable for the actions of someone else.
But part of that is that you cannot be guilty by association. It doesn't mean that you cannot know someone or have a conversation with them and that make you a socialist. That makes you someone who's willing to have a conversation. And you had to admire him for the fact that he was willing to have those conversations with different entities and different viewpoints, which I think is what journalism ought to be doing anyway. He just did a great job of responding to McCarthy.
Yeah, he said something when he's addressing that point about the book being dedicated to him about the author of that book. He's like, hey, McCarthy has come and said, hey, we're great friends and we are definitely acquaintances. Absolutely. But also our relationship is one in of its own. And so he and I don't insist on agreement with political principles as a precondition for friendship or conversation. And I think that is a big thing that we're missing right now. And especially that we talk about on this podcast is it's really, really great and helpful to have opposing views, to get somebody else's perspective and how important that really is, rather than being stuck in your own echo chamber of everybody who thinks and sees things exactly the way that you do. And I think he does a really good job at kind of defending that stance, if you will.
And yet acknowledging the fear that's involved in this. I mean, it could have been his job. That could have been the end. There's actually another journalist who commits suicide through this story because of the attacks that have been made on him, and that he just doesn't see a way out. He's in the middle of a divorce. He's being attacked, and he just can't do. So that's one of the things that I think I want to make relevant here is that, yes, there's a great deal of fear and there's a lot of attack, and that those attacks can be really, what's the word?
Impactful.
Yeah. I mean, they can go a lot farther than I think people want them to go. And because you just don't know where other people are walking and what's going on in their lives. And so I just feel like there's a caution here that we need to say, guard your words, protect your words, and make sure that they're relevant. Don't just be a bully because you can be and because it's anonymous and you can do that, because those words still have impact.
Well, I think that they still have impact, but I think that there's still an impact of not saying anything.
Yes, which I think is our other point here. I think that's our other point here.
I think one of the things that is really important to highlight is that each individual has to have a certain amount of resolve to stand up for the things that they believe in. If you don't have that level of resolve, and even if you do, maybe you should go back and check what you're speaking for or arguing for, debating for, because if someone can shake your resolve so easily, then maybe you need to reassess what it is that you're trying to stand up for.
Yeah. I've had this conversation this week with someone that I care deeply about, that not saying anything is as bad as saying mean things, and the impact of not saying anything, and honestly the repercussions of that, because I do think it lessens you when you're not willing to stand up, like you say, Boo, with your own integrity and your own value and where you're going to stand. And I think you have to stand up, and you have to do that with a willingness to be open-minded.
Absolutely.
And I know that's a fine line between I want to hear the other side and this is what I believe. I know that that's a double-edged sword, but I also believe that in the times that we're in and the times that they talk about, it's critical to where we stand as Americans.
Yes. Cole, what is that? You sent us a deal here, a chart. You literally sent us a chart here a little while ago, and it was basically, I was looking really fast to see if I could pull it up so I didn't look like a total moron, because I don't exactly remember what it was called, but it was along the lines of the less confident you are about something. What was that?
So I sent you a picture of a chart that is supposed to be a representation of the Dunning-Kruger effect.
Yes. That's exactly what it was. And so somebody who thinks that they know a whole bunch about something has a really high level of confidence, but a low level of intellect. And that makes them more dangerous versus somebody who has a very deep knowledge in this subject, knows that there's still a bunch of stuff that they don't know. And that makes them a lot more helpful and productive, I guess, isn't even the right term. But in terms of discussing that topic, you can discuss that topic at length. They're more open-minded to hearing other perspectives and differences on it and applying that to what they already know. And so I don't want to say that their confidence level drops, but it does. It really, truly does in a really healthy way.
Yeah, I would say that's the case. So the Dunning-Kruger effect, the chart is, like you mentioned, your x-axis is your level of knowledge or expertise. Your y-axis is your level of confidence. And closer to your 0 point on your grid, on both sides, your confidence and your expertise are extremely low. And then as you gain a little bit of expertise, your confidence has a massive increase to say, oh, I know a little bit, so I know a lot about this one particular subject. And then as your expertise grows, that confidence starts to fall back off and move back towards the downside as you start to realize, okay, maybe I don't know as much about this as I thought. And then over time, as you reach the level of expertise to get to being an expert, that confidence starts to grow back up, but it never gets back to the same level as your first level of confidence when you were just starting to learn about something.
Actually, still very ignorant on it.
Isn't that amazing, though? It never gets to the same level that you originally thought you were at. That's funny.
So after the play the other day, they had a couple of interviews and I felt like it was a really interesting kind of mix of people. They had the head of CNN as the network head there, who I feel like in a lot of maybe I'm not a CNN watcher, but I feel like in a lot of applications, you wouldn't have much access to that person. And so I thought it was really fascinating to go ahead and bring him in, be a part of an interview with other people, with other journalists, new journalists, old, longtime journalists. I mean, different people within his organization and outside of his organization, for him to come in and say, hey, this is a lot. And this is really important for us to kind of toe the line of what is good and right and real and reasonable, but also what makes money. And so they also followed that interview up with one directly between Scott Pelley and Anderson Cooper. And I think Scott Pelley did a really nice job. I mean, he's probably the closest thing we have to mom, like you've referred to in the past, like a Walter Cronkite, somebody that you know and trust and you know what it is that they're reporting on. They have conviction in it rather than just putting it out there for clicks. Yeah. But he had some really poignant moments, but he said something at one point, you cannot have democracy without journalism. And I think
I had to stop and think about that, though.
Yeah, I mean, you do.
But he also says that journalism is the one industry that's protected in the Constitution, and that's under the freedom of speech. And so if you dig into that a little bit, you're right. It was very poignant for him to say, very knowledgeable even for him to say. I want to go back and just a little bit because we've also talked over the last week over the fairness doctrine and get just a little scoop because I think that kind of plays a role in some of this. So the fairness doctrine was put in and it addressed radio and television and said that if you present one viewpoint, you have to give time for the other viewpoint, which is what Murrow did. He made his statement and then they invited McCarthy in to respond to that. And so that kept journalism and television a little bit more
honest,
accountable.
That's the great word. Then Reagan came in and took the fairness doctrine out, repealed it. And I think the other thing that was really interesting with that is that the fairness doctrine never addressed cable television or streaming television. It was only for radio and television. So
broadcast.
Yes. So if you were outside of those two arenas, the fairness doctrine didn't apply to you. You couldn't be held to that. And then Reagan comes in and at the urging of companies said, we're not,
you're infringing on our First Amendment rights, our freedom of speech.
So he repeals
we want
it.
you to take this away.
And so now we have this free-for-all. You can say whatever you want to say. You don't have to support it. You don't have to give the other side. You don't have to be unbiased, really. You can say whatever you want to.
Yeah, the absence of any kind of regulation or regulating principle even really did open up the floodgates for people to start viewing the
Partisan
news.
media.
Do what?
It opened up the floodgates for partisan media.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it gave that opportunity for ideology to rule over actual information. And so this was the Fairness Doctrine was in place from 1949 to 1987. And I think that there's some really good guiding principles in that we're lacking today. You know, we've talked about in other capacities about how media, journalism, specifically journalists, are kind of the fourth pillar of representation within our government. So it's not official, but it's kind of there and it's kind of not there. But how having reporting on the things that are going on within our government at every level of our government, it is important for that information to be shared with the people in which are being governed. And with the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, anything can be said. Everything can be said.
So there are a couple of points that I want to make here, but I want to back up for just a second to something that you had from Scott Pelley, where he says you cannot have democracy without journalism. And I want to put a really, really fine point on this because I think it's extremely pertinent and something that everyone who participates in our democracy needs to pay attention to. You cannot cast an informed vote without being informed.
Yes.
And you need to check the information that you're basing that vote on against multiple sources. You cannot make an informed vote if all you watch is Fox News. You cannot make an informed vote if all you watch is CNN. You cannot make an informed vote if all you're doing is seeing what everybody on your friends list on Facebook is posting because
that's not how algorithms work, guys.
Yeah, very, very specifically, that is the opposite of how algorithms are intended to work.
Yes. An algorithm is not giving you a whole plethora of information. It is only giving you the information and feeding you the information that will shock you, that will make you scared, and will keep you on the app.
That will interact. That will lead to further interaction.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And so what he says there with you cannot have democracy without journalism, I think is absolutely correct. Because again, in order to be a democracy, people have to cast votes. In order to cast votes, they should be informed votes. And I think by and large, we are not. I've made this comment several times this week. We've been talking about the perceived level of intelligence and the people around us. And the joke that I made was we talked about, well, surely people aren't that stupid. And I said, well, maybe that's true, but if that's the case, how is Ted Cruz still in office? How has he been voted in and maintained his seat for as long as he has if people are casting informed votes? There was another point that I wanted to make there, and I've completely lost the plot at this point. We were talking about you can't have democracy without journalism,
being smart, voting for Ted Cruz.
Yeah, that point is made. I think that is a fine enough point on that. Callie, right before I backtracked to you can't have democracy without journalism, we were talking about the rise and fall of the Fairness Doctrine. And I think that we have moved far, far away from fairness in media coverage these days. And, some people may come in and they may say, well, if you watch X broadcast, they have people from the other side on all the time. Or if you watch Y broadcast, they have people on from the other side all the time. I can't tell you the last time I watched an interview where they were having a discussion with opposition where it was, for one, fair, because it always seems like there are traps being laid in the conversation.
Ganging up on folks.
Yeah, if it's a one-on-one situation, then the entire conversation is a trap to try and lead them to say one specific phrase so that they can get a soundbite. And if it's not set up that way, it's 2-on-1 or 3-on-1 or 4-on-1 just to make it look like this one idea is in the minority. And I think that is not only not fair, I think it's disingenuous.
But it makes money.
Oh, yeah, very much so.
Well,
very
and I
much
think
so.
that is, we've talked about Mary Jane Moore with MJ from Threads, the attorney out of New York, and she did a whole thing kind of about the fairness doctrine. I mean, tangentially about the fairness doctrine, and I'll share that link in the show notes that you can go on and check it out because it's a super fascinating thread, and I think she does a really good job of A, breaking it down clearly, and B, kind of warning of the danger of the fall of the fairness doctrine. But it all started out with here just recently. If you have not been living under a rock, you have definitely seen Tucker Carlson going off on a couple of things, talking about what does he say? Something about turning up the propaganda fire hose to full blast.
To full blast to manipulate the elderly.
On Fox News. It had nothing to do with facts. It was all just what was going to keep people watching and tuned in and scared. And then he went through a whole interview with Ted Cruz here just recently. And kind of like Cole was talking about, there are lots of gotcha moments in there. And I'm not here to be some kind of Ted Cruz advocate or a Tucker Carlson advocate for that matter. But there was reporting done that definitely you can see whether it skews for or against your beliefs, but it definitely skews to a specific point and making Ted Cruz look like a moron. And
I don't know that was the point of the interview. It was definitely executed that way.
Yeah, which it's Ted Cruz. Maybe that's not that hard. So
yeah, I was about to say, I think that may just be the inevitable conclusion in an instance like that, but it very well could have been. I don't know that was the original intention, but it definitely ended up being that.
Yes. Well, and then I think that the other part of this, we've talked about the illusory truth effect, and just because it's said online, that has to make it true, and that is real. And because I saw it in my algorithm, that makes it true. And Edward R. Murrow said something about we must remember always that accusation is not proof and that conviction depends upon evidence and due process of law. And I think especially in today's political climate, that couldn't be more well received by me and my heart in this moment, talking about fighting for due process. Like that's one of the founding principles of our democracy. And we're watching it right now being kind of just thrown out the window in a lot of different facets. And
context is intentionally being removed from conversations and from quotes to make the other side look bad. And it's done on both sides of the aisle
all the
to a degree that is insane. I was watching just last night, there was apparently a reporter had asked Trump a question about his director of intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, who had said that in a congressional hearing back in March, she had said that as of right now, Iran is not working towards a nuclear weapon, and their nuclear weapon program has been put on hold by the supreme leader as part of her intelligence brief to Congress. And that has been taken out of context several times this week to say, oh, we didn't know that Iran was this close to building a nuclear weapon. And it's been used to try and pit this administration against itself. But if you go back and you listen to the entire congressional hearing, which I did last night, and you read through the transcript of the congressional hearing, less than 30 seconds away, almost within the same sentence, it is very abundantly clear that the intelligence director says Iran has an exceptionally high level of refined uranium, of enriched uranium, much higher than that of a country who would not be working towards a nuclear weapon. And it is very important that this is a situation that we monitor. But the sentence before that, when it stated that the Ayatollah, the supreme leader, has not given the go-ahead to resume working towards a nuclear weapon, that sentence is singled out and used to say, oh, well, your director of intelligence doesn't know what they're talking about if we're now dropping bombs on Iran to destroy their nuclear program like we did yesterday.
Right.
And just the level of deceit
that
is being used by media in general on, again, both sides of the political spectrum, to me, is disgusting and insane.
Yeah. I mean, MJ breaks it down really clearly. Rage is the goal because
Very much
rage
so.
equals ratings. Outrage builds brand loyalty, and nuance is boring. So we as a media company don't want to put our viewers to sleep. We want them right here, tuned in, fired up, waiting, hanging on our every word for the next disaster, chaos moment, fear-mongering second, so that they're trusting us. They're trusting us to tell them what it is that they believe. And when you take something like the fairness doctrine out of play, I mean, Mom said it said it a little bit earlier. Broadcast television, your regular, I don't have cable, satellite, internet, anything TV that every TV can get, or at least it used to. They are monitored by a specific standard and set of rules by the FCC that is totally and completely different of what cable is held accountable to. And
I
so
didn't know that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I just didn't realize that they had different rules.
They have not just different rules, but very
Technically, no.
different rules.
Yeah.
Not even close.
I mean, in my head, I thought news is news. So, but it isn't. It depends on where that news is coming from.
Yes.
There's a little bit more nuance to it than that. And I think this lines up perfectly with one of the quotes that really, really hit me from Good Night and Good Luck. There at the very, very end of the movie, he's making a speech. He's being recognized for something at CBS. And in context, he's talking about essentially his style of reporting and how, okay, maybe sponsors won't like it that much, and maybe it won't get as much traction as something a little bit more controversial. But he goes on to say, to those who say people wouldn't look, that they wouldn't be interested, they're too complacent, indifferent, and insulated, I can only reply, there is, in one reporter's opinion, considerable evidence against that contention. But even if they are right, what have they got to lose? Because if they are right, and this instrument is good for nothing but to entertain, amuse, and insulate, then the tube is flickering now, and we will soon see that the whole struggle is lost. This instrument can teach. It can illuminate, and yes, it can even inspire, but it can do so only to the extent that humans are determined to use it towards those ends. Otherwise, it is merely wires and lights in a box. And I thought that was extremely powerful.
That's good.
Yeah, I agree.
What would he say today? I just feel like his message would be identical.
Yes.
And I can't imagine the level of frustration that he would think as he looked at how far we've fallen. You know, I think the whole thing about the play, the movie, is how much fear they had for speaking the truth. And if you look, and that was in the 50s, so we're talking 70, 75 years ago. If you're looking at that and feel like we have lost so much ground in the process of that, I can't imagine how disgruntled he would be.
I was talking to Callie about this earlier, and I think by and large, it is kind of that pendulum swing that we have referred to here lately, where it's swung to the other side. Because a lot of the things that he talks about in that kind of final speech is how the advertisers and networks don't want this kind of content. And he disagrees with that because the American people have grown too comfortable, too complacent, too averse to controversy. And I think at this point, it has really swung by and large to the opposite end of the spectrum, where we will only interact with things that enrage us. We will only participate in echo chambers. We will only, we have become so disinsulated, so uninsulated from all of this information that it has overwhelmed by, very much so. And so I think he would say, okay, it's swung too far. We have lost reason at this point. Instead of not paying attention, instead of not paying attention to or being too complacent, we are overly sensitive to ideas that are any different than our own.
Yeah. He says something in that kind of last little speech that he gives. We have currently, and remember, this is 1950. We have currently a built-in allergy to unpleasant or disturbing information. Our mass media reflect this. But unless we get up off our fat surpluses and recognize that television in the main is being used to distract, delude, amuse, and insulate us, then television and those who finance it, those who look at it, and those who work at it may see a totally different picture too late.
I think by and large that is still the case, but I think it's almost in the opposite direction. Mm-hmm. Yes, it is still used to distract, delude, and amuse. But at this point, like you were saying, Callie, it has desensitized us to these controversial topics. And I think at this point, some people are just so tired of hearing talking heads scream at each other about it that they just are disinterested in participation.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you have the whole part about if it doesn't get covered by media, did it even happen? If it isn't this big, huge spot on the life cycle that is news, does it really count? I mean, it feels very much like if a tree falls in the woods and there's no one here to hear it, does it make a sound? And I think, Cole, you were talking about it a minute ago. We are inundated with so much news constantly all the time, especially we've talked about it before. This administration that's one of their strategies, push more and more and more and more and more out there so that to the point that we are
exhausted.
Exhausted. Yes. Exhausted, desensitized, all of these different things that we truly cannot comprehend what the reality is anymore. And I think that there is something in there that the bottom line of that turns into gatekeeping the power of airtime.
Absolutely.
We're going to utilize this time and we're going to use our viewers to sway this direction, this way. And it all has to do with money.
Very much so.
So in the aftermath, when they were talking to the room full of journalists, it was Connie Chung, who is retired. Anderson Cooper was there. They also had a news anchor there. And the statement was made that, I'm going to get this wrong, that truth is not fact. Did I say that right? Truth is not fact. And I was just like, and I got really tickled because I had a reaction. And then this young journalist was like, wait. What do you mean? What do you mean? Fact and truth should be the same thing. And they had a little debate on it. And I came back to y'all and I go, oh, now wait, if it's a fact, it's truth. But Cole, you see that differently.
My interpretation of the definition of the word fact is something stated as truth. But just because it is stated as truth doesn't make it true. Mom, your hair is blonde. That is a fact, or stated at least as such, but it is not the truth.
And see, I think a fact is a proven point.
I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, I think that should be the case. But if so, why do we need both words? Why do we need truth and fact?
So I went a little bit different at this and went and looked up the actual definition. And even just now, Mom, when you were talking about what a fact is. So according to the Oxford Dictionary, a fact is a thing that is known or proved to be true. So, Mom, you have blonde hair. Can't be proven to be true without dyeing your hair. But at the same time, the legal definition of what is a fact is a little bit different. The legal definition of a fact is the truth about events as opposed to interpretation. And then when you're talking about it in terms of media coverage, I think that, we've touched on it a little bit throughout all of these different things. Depending on which channel you're watching, every single media outlet is cherry picking their version of the truth. But what the reality is, those truths require context. You cannot take one single line out of a 2-hour interview and make up an entire personality for one person.
Or their entire perspective on even on a small subject.
Yeah.
And at this point, media explicitly and specifically eliminates context for their own personal gain.
Right.
Which is where
Right.
they should be putting their efforts into, is in the context.
Yeah, which to me is very disingenuous and anti-journalistic principles.
Yeah.
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 You know, and we talk about kind of cherry picking and the spin that gets put on those things. I put an example in here. The fact might be that is stated by the media. The fact might be crime is up. Okay.
Ivermectin is horse dewormer.
Right. But the misleading implication that gets put out to you who are sitting here watching it is, well, people are unsafe everywhere. And that isn't the reality of crime being up. And we've taken away all of the nuance, all of the context to keep you outraged.
Crime may
that
be
makes
up
me
in
money.
this area, and it may have something to do with a particular happening going on, but that doesn't mean crime is up across the nation or everywhere or where you live.
Well, it
Which-
also depends on how you're looking at it from a mathematical standpoint. If we
True.
look at it this way, let's say that we're talking about a population of 100,000 in 2024 and 100 murders are committed.
Okay.
But in 2025, our population is 125,000 and murder is at 101. From an empirical standpoint, crime is up. But from a percentage or a per capita standpoint, it's down. So you can
Yeah.
say either one of those is truth. It just depends on how you say it.
And
Yeah.
the context in which you give.
I always have said that numbers can be turned to say whatever you want them to say. I mean, if you look at a P&L statement, it's not always just red and black, no pun intended, but it's not always, you can jig those a little bit and move those numbers around to make them say what you really want your investors to focus on.
Yeah. Training the narrative.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. But at the very end of the day, when you total everything up, balance sheets don't lie.
But I think that that's such an interesting point. You as your CEO of your company can go and put out whatever narrative you want, but it is on the responsibility of each of your investors and your board members to do all of that tallying and to pay attention to that, how it comes out and sums out at the end of the day.
Their own due diligence.
Correct.
Yeah. Yeah. So fascinating. I would recommend the movie for sure. But I mean, the other thing that we talked about was trust in the media. And so you did some research for us, Cal, to find out where that is and what has changed on it.
Yeah, I did. So I'm pulling information from a couple of different places that I tried to keep pretty central, not leaning one way in one bias or the other. And so I'm pulling stuff from the Pew Research Center and from the Associated Press and Gallup News, which are all supposed to be pretty centralized in general. So as of March 2025, so just a few months ago, 81% of Democrats reported at least some trust in information from national news outlets, compared to just 53% of Republicans.
That's significant difference.
Almost 30%
National.
difference.
So what's your take? Why? What causes the difference there? If it's a national news outlet, what do y'all think is generating that difference?
So I think a couple of things are true. So the next kind of point in here that I put is Republicans' trust rose from 40% in late 2024 to that 53% in 2025, in March of 2025, from a significant 13-point jump. So from 40% in the end of 2024 to 53%. And look at what has happened in their party politically.
Well, and if you're talking in 24, that would have been under Biden.
Mm-hmm.
So anything that anybody said about Biden can't be true. Any good thing in 2024 said about Biden can't be true. So you would automatically assume that it was wrong, right?
I don't know that I can go there with you.
I think
mean,
that,
we're
that
looking
likely is part of it.
I think that it's part of it, but I don't think that you can just, again, I think that that's the context and that's the nuance, right? I don't think that you can take that one statement and say, hey, this is a definitive statement from that one piece of information.
Okay, I get that, but I'm trying to figure out why there's such a significant gap between Republicans and Democrats on national news sources.
Generally speaking, I think there are more outlets that have a left-leaning bias than there are outlets, at least on a national level. I mean, nationally speaking, who has a right-leaning bias outside of Fox that are a main broadcast news network?
Yeah.
Yeah, the New York Post. I'm just looking at All Sides Media. So if you have stuff on the right, I don't know any of these.
So we're just naturally going to discount anything spoken because it's not right-leaning.
Yeah, I mean, just on right-leaning and far right, these are the ones like that I've heard of. Fox News, New York Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Examiner.
Well, the Wall Street Journal is center.
Wall Street Journal News, yes. Wall Street Journal Opinion leans right.
That makes more sense. That I can see.
OAN is far right. The New York Post Opinion is far right. The Independent Journal Review is far right. Fox News, the Daily Wire, Daily Mail.
I mean, to be really honest with you, I'm shocked that Democrats are that high. In March of 85, 81%.
March of
Some trust.
25.
What did I say?
85.
I would
oh,
say
Lord,
that
let's hope not.
I would say that a perspective from the right would be that left-leaning media outlets have a tendency to lean into what conservatives would often, I don't want to say it that way, self-proclaimed right-wing Americans would say that those outlets are pandering specifically to their audience in an effort to build trust in a disingenuous manner. I'm not saying that that is what's happening, but I would tell you that those who represent the right, particularly the far right, that would be the explanation that they would give, I would expect.
So one of the other kind of pieces of information that I found really fascinating was that in also March of 2025, only two outlets, Forbes and the Wall Street Journal, earned the majority of trust from both parties. And then Republicans heavily trust Fox News, 56%, and the Joe Rogan Experience, 31%, while Democrats place trust in a much wider array of media outlets, including PBS, CNN, BBC, New York Times, Associated Press, MSNBC, and NPR, all within 30 to 60% trust. So I thought that was really fascinating that the right has a very small, consolidated place that they can trust, whereas the left tends to trust a lot more outlets.
A variety
of outlets, yes.
It's interesting that when you look at this all sides chart, how probably half of those that are listed in the center are financial news, because the numbers don't lie. You can lie about the numbers and you can use the numbers to lie, but the numbers themselves don't. And so I think that that's probably why you have a lot of trust in financial news sources like the Wall Street Journal and Forbes, because they're talking about the numbers.
That's the focus of their news. Gotcha.
So then there was a Gallup poll at the end of September of 2024, so last year, found that only 31% of Americans have either a great deal of or a fair amount of confidence that mass media is reporting fully accurately and fairly, which is a record low.
And that means less than a third of America thinks that mass media is even partially telling the truth.
Again, to put that into even better perspective, that means of the three of us, only one of us believes that.
Which one is it?
It's you, because you're the most gullible.
No.
Shots fired.
So it's all of that research was then triangulated with some of the Pew Research studies, and public skepticism of national news media is at a 50-year low, especially on the right. It just is crazy to me. And local media is a little bit better than national outlets, but not a ton.
Well, and I think that there is a little bit of a misconception that local outlets have less incentive. And this is probably fair, that they have less incentive to be disingenuous. But I think that what a lot of people don't necessarily realize is that many of those local studios and outlets are under one of these big news broadcasters. And depending on which one you're under, that could vastly vary the amount of freedom you have in your coverage. And that is exploited by, there was a Last Week Tonight episode in the last probably year or so that I watched, where he goes in and he talks specifically about this one guy who owns, it's like 175 or 275 local networks. And this one guy has his own segment on all of them that is basically pre-recorded, that gets pushed out. And it's a pretty extremely far right sentiment with a lot of his personal reporting or a lot of his personal editorializing opinion pieces that he comes on and talks about. And those little local studios, little local networks, because they are essentially owned by him, they have a requirement to broadcast that. Regardless of the people who work at those networks, what their personal beliefs are or their personal sentiments are, these little local networks are required to broadcast as this. He owns them.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I suppose it makes sense, but at the same time, I feel like maybe we need to have some sort of check and balance, something regulatory that is saying, hey, you can do this, but at the same time, there needs to be additional context provided in these instances. There has to be something to even this out a little.
You mean like a fairness doctrine?
Something like that.
But also, let's just take Mom and celebrate just a little win right there. Cole pushing for regulation.
He's on a tear today.
I think
Stumped him.
I don't know that I would say stumped, but regulation is obviously necessary. It is the amount of regulation that is in question and how that regulation is utilized. Do I think that you need to check who is able to get a gun? Yeah, absolutely. Do I think you should weaponize those checks to prevent all citizenry from being able to acquire guns? Probably not. So there's a bit of a balancing act that has to go on there. And kind of going back to the Federalist 51 that we talked about recently, you can't just use a minority that's in power or a majority to oppress a minority. I don't think that's reasonable or what the Founding Fathers intended. But in order for something to happen, it has to be for the greater good of all.
Well, and I think that there's a difference between oppression and accountability. And so holding people accountable, whether you're talking about gun rights or media bias, is totally different than oppressing them and saying, no, you can't talk about this. No, you can't spend any time on that.
Agree.
Yeah.
So I think, too, because of the changes that we've seen, you guys don't get your news from the same place that I get my news. For sure. And
sometimes.
So I think
it depends.
I would say that's not 100% accurate.
I'm going to say that y'all use social media a lot more than I do for what you perceive. Not that you're not checking that out, but you're starting with social media. Sometimes you're hearing it first there and then going to look at it somewhere else.
That's probably fair.
Again, I think that comes back to if you're only going to have guidelines for particular types of media and not for all media, that you also have there's a hole there.
A natural skew.
Yes. That needs to be closed up so that everybody kind of has the same kind of guidelines. And I mean, we know that social media doesn't have any guidelines whatsoever. I mean,
well,
say
that's
whatever
not
you
exactly
want.
true.
Okay. Give me a good example.
Well, I can post anything on social media. And I can post a video of us talking about how to load a dishwasher, and one platform might completely skew and talk about how we are toxic feminists and we are ruining our marriages and all of this, whereas the next social media platform said, yeah, ladies, you're right on. We gotta come together and figure this out.
Yeah.
And so I think that the moment that you empower we the people, depending on where you are and where you're looking, that all gets skewed really quickly.
But we're talking about skew, not regulation. You can't regulate against having a skew from person to person. But you're saying that there's no regulation on social media. That's not quite true. Terroristic threats are unacceptable on most platforms and will get you banned or demonetized. talking about certain.
I could come back and say, I think you should die. And in my book, that's terrorism, but it doesn't.
And on most platforms, you would either be banned or demonetized for saying something like that.
I don't think so.
I think that
I know
has
that
changed.
that's the case.
So I sat here, I don't even remember what the post was on the other day, and people went berserk on this person. Again, I can't remember what it was, to the point that I started going in and reporting things when people are being bullies, when people are calling out their gender or their sex or their sexual orientation and calling them all of these things and saying, hey, I hope that you die. And I think I reported 15 or so posts. And I just recently, like almost a week later, got information back from the platform that I was on that said, hey, we reviewed this and no action was taken on every single one of them.
Here's the thing. I hope that you die and I'm going to kill you are very different.
Yes.
You're right.
These were pretty blatant.
Violent.
I wish I could remember what it was about, but it was about somebody was complaining about somebody had been killed or been hit with something. And the response was, too bad you didn't get hit with those bullets and you didn't die.
That's not a threat.
No.
Does it make it appropriate?
I'm not saying that social media is regulated that everything has to be appropriate. But I'm saying that many of them do moderate and regulate to some degree. Oftentimes that moderation and regulation has a very heavy political skew.
And is internal, not across the board.
Sure, that's fair.
Well, what's on Meta may not be on the other one.
Sure.
May not be on social. And that's what I think that's what.
It would be very difficult to regulate something like that from a federal government standpoint because of the First Amendment.
Okay.
I mean, I guess like at what point do we as a society think and start policing, hey, I hope you die. I wish you had been the one who died, as being reasonable.
Well, you don't have to say that it's reasonable, but you can't take away someone's right to say it. Again, enshrined within the First Amendment. That is, the First Amendment does not cover direct threats, but that is not a threat. That is a sentiment saying, I don't like you. I wish you were dead. And people have the right to say that.
I guess
Doesn't make it right or good, but if you don't protect that speech, then there is other speech that is also no longer protected that degrades the rest of our civil liberties.
I hear you.
So I get what you're saying.
Like that.
I really do. And I don't agree with those people. And I don't think that what they're saying was right. But you don't combat bad speech by censoring it. You combat bad speech with good speech. To say, hey, I think you're being unreasonable. I think that all life is precious. I don't think that you should be talking to someone that way. And I understand that the response you're likely going to get from that person is going to be F you. I get that.
But that's my point. I mean, Cole, you always say, especially on this podcast, you can't legislate morality.
You can't.
So I don't think that we can, and I agree with that. I don't think that we can sit here and put it on the platforms to say, hey, you have to go ahead and regulate these things. You have to sit here and say, you have to be the censor. But how does that work otherwise? Because I think when we take the accountability of all of that out of the way and just say, oh, well, they have a First Amendment right to sit here and wish that you died, that sucks. And it puts us in the position, a precarious position, that nothing is out of line.
But there are things that are out of line, and there are things that aren't protected by the First Amendment. But ill will towards someone else isn't one of them. I understand that it's ugly and you don't like it. I get that. I don't like it either. But not everybody feels the same way.
I'm thinking back on the suicide that was addressed in Good Night and Good Luck because of that exact same kind of attention that was given. The underpinning of his journalistic personality, the attacks on him personally, and what that caused. And I don't know, okay, let me say this. They all saw that and they kept saying, like you say to us quite often, Cole, don't read the comments. Because the comments can get you. And so they all said, don't listen to O'Brien. because it was one other journalist that was really going after him. Don't listen. You know that's O'Brien. Don't listen to O'Brien. But sometimes it goes deeper than that, and you can't just turn it off. You can't just
and
dismiss
just because
it.
you turned it off doesn't mean anybody else did.
Yeah.
And so all of those flames are continuing to be fanned.
Yes.
And that's where I struggle with kind of the accountability side of it.
And I guess what I was going for is I would like for it to be, Callie, where you could have said to those people, that's inappropriate language and you should not be saying that. Because, Cole, that's what I'm hearing you say, is that we can't expect for the media platform to regulate that or to censor that. And so it comes down to the individuals who have to censor that. But I think that if Callie had responded to those people, all that would do is bring that onto her. And maybe it would pull a group together that would say, you know what, she's right. You need to tone it down. You need to stop.
Well, that is how the marketplace of ideas works, though. You're exactly right. It likely, a one-on-one situation like that likely would have little impact on the other party. It might, but it may take 20 or 30 or 1,000 people saying, hey, man, you shouldn't be saying this. But that's not where our society is at right now. Our society is at right now where, yeah, that's totally fine for them to say. Where kill yourself is a common everyday phrase that is used against people all of the time. Is that right or good? No, I don't think so. But that is where the rest of our society is largely at least those who are participating in those online communities.
I think this is the basis of this whole podcast when we're talking about Murrow and addressing McCarthy and the risk that he took to do that. This is the whole thing.
100%. And he didn't do it alone, but he did it against someone who had considerably more power than him.
Yes.
And he took a massive risk, and he did it anyways. And we, as Americans, have to be willing to stand up and do the same thing. And it's scary, and it's hard. But you can't be silenced. You cannot let your voice be silenced. And you have to have the resolve to do something like that in order to affect change in the way that you're desiring to.
So bringing it kind of back around into the media, my question becomes, is bias inevitable in any human storytelling?
Likely, yes.
And so should journalists try and be neutral and represent both sides, or is moral clarity sometimes necessary?
I think that both of those things can exist together, but I think they need to be very, very, very clearly separated in news media. I think that it is okay and oftentimes required to editorialize, to give opinions on things that have happened, to say, hey, but in order to do so, you have to give the full context, to say, this is everything that occurred, and here is how I feel about it. Here is how I think about it. And I think that those should probably be very, very distinctly defined. If you have a 30-minute piece and you want to editorialize on this, you want to have an opinion on this, I think you have to give the full context before you can do so. Because oftentimes I can give my opinion and say XYZ about something because he said just A. But in reality, he said A, B, and C, and B and C offer additional context that kind of makes my opinion irrelevant because they've already talked about it and oftentimes refuted something that could be inferred from category A. So I think both of those things can exist. I think you can try and report on something in an unbiased fashion and say, this is exactly what happened and here's all of it, the whole truth, not just a little piece of it, the whole truth. Because lies by omission are still lies. And so if you say, here's the whole truth, and then here's my reaction to that whole truth, I think that's very, very different than coming in and cherry picking these couple of sentences or this one little piece of an idea and saying this whole idea is bad because of this one little piece without the additional context of the rest of the idea.
You've just described tangled news.
And I think tangled news is pretty good at doing that.
Yeah. Here's what the left is saying, and sometimes the left doesn't agree. Here's what the right is saying, and they don't always, the message is not the same, and here's my take on this. You've just described tangled news.
Which I think is such a powerful tool. Tangle specifically is such a powerful news outlet because it does do that. Here is what the right is saying. Here's what the left is saying. Here's our opinion in this particular instance. And so no matter what topic it is that they're covering that day, they do a really good job at showcasing both sides and very clearly labeling opinion. So that kind of brings me to my next question. Tangle, I think we just talked about, is doing a good job at that. But what about the rest of mass mainstream media? Is it redeemable? Can it be fixed? Can it be utilized to be news?
Yes, it can be fixed, but it is going to take a lot of voices to say, we don't want this to be done in this manner. It's going to take a lot of integrity from those journalists, from the corporations. From those corporations that run it, they're going to, it comes back to what Cole says. Greed runs everything, and it is that corporation's job to make money. And
they have a legal prerogative.
They do. And yet there's also a line there of when is enough enough? And so,
but you can't think about it that way from the perspective of a corporation, because enough is never enough, because they have a legal prerogative to try and provide value for shareholders. There is no enough for a corporation that is publicly traded.
Well, then does that make your argument that it's not redeemable? Or can we have institutions that have integrity?
Again, I think you can have both. I think it's difficult, but I think you can. But I think that requires a very high level of accountability because here's the thing. When you're talking about revenue for news media, what's the product?
You.
Exactly.
Your eyes, your time.
Exactly. We are the product for news media. Advertisers are where they get all of their revenue from. And so if you want to talk, and this is exactly what Murrow was talking about in that paragraph that I quoted earlier. Well, people say that nobody wants to watch this. Nobody cares about the nuance. Nobody cares about the context. Well, in my opinion, I don't think that's true, because I care about the context. I think it's extremely important. Maybe not everyone feels that way, but some people do. And if there was a mainstream news outlet that presented itself that way, that wasn't just blatantly irreverent of that context, I would probably watch
successful?
them.
But you're kind of an outlier.
That's fair to say.
I'm going back to kind of the Dunning-Kruger effect of all of this. The amount of people who are willing to put in that knowledge and that time is always going to be smaller than the group of people who have a ton of confidence and no knowledge.
So does that mean that it's up to the broadcasters and it's up to the journalists and not the corporation, like it was with Murrow and CBS?
I think that'd be a pretty good start.
I think that's a big ask, but I agree with you.
I mean, going back to what Scott Pelley was talking about when he was talking with Anderson Cooper right after the show, he said something about being a journalist takes both fear and courage.
Well, you can't have courage without fear.
What?
You can't have courage without fear.
Courage
don't is disagree. Just being scared and doing it anyways.
I don't disagree, but I think that is one of the things that has to be pertinent as a journalist. To be a good journalist, I think that you have to have a healthy dose of fear. And I don't like fear any more than the next person. I don't want to be afraid, but I think that, what is it? Isn't it Marilyn Monroe? I can't remember who said it. Now it's going to be like, what's her name? I can't think of it. But who says it? It's like, if people are talking about you, you're obviously doing something right. It's when they're not talking about you that is the problem.
I believe that's a quote from Nate from earlier this week. I hope y'all have haters, because if you've got haters, you're doing something right.
Yeah. Yeah. Now I'm second guessing myself whether it's Eleanor Roosevelt or Marilyn Monroe, and I don't know, and I don't remember.
Oh,
but
wow.
I know. But I mean, the kind of sentiment is still the same. And so I think that a healthy dose of fear as a journalist is really important. I mean, you guys, we are not by any stretch real journalists with this podcast. This is opinion, this is our takes and all of that. But even that requires a huge amount of vulnerability. And we've talked about it. We don't always say the nicest things about people. And those are our opinions on them. And I called Ted Cruz a moron just a minute ago. And so I think that even something like this on a small scale still requires both the fear of saying it and the courage to say it in order for it to be even remotely important.
Callie, you have a line here. There's actually 4 lines. 3 of them I think are really important. The 4th one is in quotes, and I'd be interested to know where this came from. But there's one here that says, maybe it's less about achieving perfect objectivity and more about transparency, accountability, and diverse sourcing. And I think that's absolutely true. I think that's really what we're talking about. Hey, I feel some type of way about this. But even though I feel some type of way, I'm still going to try and present the entire topic to you from as objective a standpoint as possible, and then I'll give you my opinion on it. And I think that that's reasonable to say, hey, here's the whole picture, or at least what we can see of the whole picture. And I'm not going to just pick out the points that make my argument look good. I'm going to give you everything and then tell you how I feel about it. And I'm going to come in and I say, this is where my opinion stems from. This is where I got my information from. That level of transparency is extremely important. But the second one here is, you've said recognizing when we're seeking confirmation versus seeking truth. And like we've talked about, mainstream media and these algorithms that we're dealing with are specifically designed to put us into an echo chamber, to only show us things that we either completely agree with or totally enrage us, to drive interaction, not to provide any nuance to make us think. Because if I have to press pause on this video to think about something for a minute, I'm not interacting with it anymore. The last one here, or really the third out of the 4, is encouraging media literacy and healthy skepticism without falling into cynicism. I fear that I have fallen into a level of cynicism personally. I would very much like for mainstream media to become much more objective than it is right now. I don't know if that can happen in the current environment, but I would like for that to happen. I have quite a bit of cynicism about mainstream media on both sides, and even independent media at this point, because everything is for clicks. But this last quote here, where did this come from? We have to be smarter consumers and demand better content.
It's just me. I was just talking.
Well, you're exactly right.
Well, thank you. Because I think that we do. I mean, it's like we talked about a minute ago. If one person gets on a comment section and says something mean and one person responds to them, especially the original poster, that may not mean much. But if a whole bunch of people come in and say, dude, get your act together, this is inappropriate, I think that has a better result, or potential result or outcome, hopefully. And I think that if we decide to be smarter consumers and demand better content, I think that we only stand to gain from that. We as a society only stand to gain from that. I'm not going to take your lies. I'm not going to accept them. I am not going to run off and start spewing them to somebody else in another forum. I'm going to do some research on it, form my own opinion, get all of the context, because I am not going to just openly, blindly trust you. And eventually that takes root. If enough people do it and are demanding better content,
eventually we're all going to kill each other, or we're going to get past this. We're going to finally get fed up and say, okay, this is enough.
Yeah.
We don't need to behave this way.
So Edward R. Murrow had one more quote that I wanted to kind of throw out here. The question is not what power unchecked can do. No, we've seen that answer. But what are you prepared to do? And so I put a couple of things in here, kind of our call to action for not only ourselves, but to each of you listening, that I think are really, really pertinent for us to be smarter consumers and to demand better content. And there were 4 things that I had. Number 1, I think you need to diversify your news diet.
Critical.
Doesn't matter where you like getting news from, keep it, fine. But go get the opposing view too. And go get 5 of them. And then form your opinion. Be a smarter consumer.
It takes time. But you shouldn't have an uninformed opinion on something that you're just broadcasting out, because then you just kind of look like a goofball.
Yep.
You look like an idiot if you're saying, oh, blah, 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 blah. And what you're saying is using information that's cherry picked or just wholly inaccurate, which I see all of the time.
Yeah. And we're all guilty of doing it.
100%.
We talked about something the other day about, I think it was in the cancel culture episode where we were talking about, you may look at a headline and the headline leads you to believe one thing, and then you click in the article and it's like, where did that headline even come from? It's not anywhere close to reality, but it is to shock you.
Yeah.
To spark outrage and to get you to click on it. And it works. So the second thing that I think that we should all do a better job at is checking our sources. You know, Cole, I'm going to kind of throw you under the bus really quick, but Cole sent me a video here a while ago and he was like, hey, this sounds really good. And it did. It totally did. But I started digging into it, going, where did this come from? What is this from? What does this actually mean? What is the rest of the context? And it was A, taken completely out of context, and B, not even relevant to the modern day application that it was being used in. And Cole very gracefully came back and said, you're totally right. I didn't know all of that. Thanks for sharing. And we were able to have a really good conversation about it and find common ground because we were both open-minded enough to say, where did this come
There's
from?
more to it than this.
There's more to it than this. So check your sources. Number 3 is supporting independent journalism. I think especially in today's day and age of social media, you have a plethora to choose from. There are all different kinds. But if your whole goal is to diversify your news diet, you should inject a healthy dose of independent journalism in that. I think that that goes and speaks to the fact that they don't have a big, huge studio or corporate overlord to answer to. And
now, I think that also urges some caution is because they don't
Mhm.
have anyone to answer to. That's a different end of the spectrum of risk of bias.
yes,
I was going to ask you who you would consider independent journalism. Is that Joe Rogan?
Maybe not Joe him. Well, to a certain extent, maybe. But I think some of the people that he interviews, and I don't agree with all of them. I think some of them are absolutely nuts. But at least they bring interesting context to the conversation that gives you an opportunity to go and verify it. I think everything that everyone says on any of these social media apps that you listen to, you should take with a minimum a grain of salt.
but there's Sharon Says So, and there is Moesh News and Katie Grossbeard, and there are lots of different ones who are just saying, hey, this is the information. And depending on the news cycle, where we are in the news cycle, you can see some of that bias and some of that skew and say, oh, okay, hold on, buddy. Let me go check this out a little bit more. Let me go look a little differently. I mean, but there are a ton of independent journalists that you can add to your diet so that you're getting other perspectives, that you're getting other takes. There
And
are
I
a
would
ton.
strongly suggest if you're going to go and find independent journalists, because they are all going to have some level of inherent bias, go find some with bias from both sides.
Yes. And then my last kind of to-do list item is talk to people who don't think like you.
And talk to them. Don't talk at them.
Yes.
Started to say
Don't be
that's my
talked
favorite
at by
one.
them.
Listen,
But-
share, absorb, and then do it again.
Yeah, you have to have some level of open-mindedness to say, hey, these things that I thought I knew, I don't know. And now I know them better because I have someone else's perspective on them. I have someone else's sources on them. I have
Yeah.
a better, more complete picture as to what's happening. I still probably don't have the whole picture. And that's something that everybody needs to remind themselves of constantly is, hey, I probably don't have the whole picture here.
I'm going to put this out there because I've been looking. I would like to find someone who is Palestinian. I would like to have a conversation with someone who's Palestinian because I've talked to someone who is Jewish and gotten their take on history in Gaza, and I'd like to hear. So if there is someone out there who would be willing to talk to me, please reach out.
Way to diversify your sources. I think that's great.
I haven't found anybody yet, so it's a little bit harder than you would think.
But you're trying, and I think that counts for a lot. Don't
Yeah.
give up. You know, I was walking with a girlfriend just this past week, and we have very opposing political leanings and views. And we started talking about immigration and riots and all of these things, gun control. And we A, had a great conversation, and B, walked away with both of us having a whole list of things that we needed to go fact check and look and do some more research on. But she said something at one point. She literally stopped walking and turned and said, "Hey, thanks for talking about stuff like this with me." And it just warmed my heart because I was so thankful. I mean, it could be really awkward and it could be really frustrating. Well, she doesn't see it the way that I see it from either perspective. And I was so grateful for us to have that time that we could just sit here and say, "Hey, I thought I knew this. What do you know about it? Am I right? Am I wrong? What do I need to go learn? What am I missing?" And I think that that is one of the most powerful tools that you can kind of maintain in your arsenal. You know, that's the whole purpose of this podcast was respectful disagreement, coming from different perspectives, talking to each other, saying, "Hey, I never thought about it like that. Hey, I didn't know that you just shared. Thanks for sharing it with me." And so I think that it is really, really important to continue having conversations with people who think differently. Cannot be underscored.
There's one more quote from Murrow that I want to touch on here before we move on, but I want to offer a little bit of context beforehand. I think that right now, fear and outrage are by far the biggest ratings drivers for mainstream media to push that fear and to drive that fear. And I think it's really, really, really important that we as Americans learn to get past that. Because even when we don't know, we as a society can come together and overcome. So this last quote, we've already touched on a couple pieces of it here, but it starts with, "No one familiar with the history of this country can deny that congressional committees are useful. It is necessary to investigate before legislating, but the line between investigating and persecuting is a very fine one, and the junior senator from Wisconsin has stepped over it repeatedly. His primary achievement has been in confusing the public mind as between the internal and external threats of communism. We must not confuse dissent with disloyalty. We must remember always that accusation is not proof and that conviction depends upon evidence and due process of law. We will not walk in fear one of another. We will not be driven by fear into an age of unreason. If we dig deep in our history and our doctrine and remember that we are not descended from fearful men, from men who feared to write, to speak, to associate, and defend causes that were, for the moment, unpopular." I think it's really important to remember the bravery of the writing of our forefathers, and certainly they were not perfect, but none of us are. And they were not fearful men for the things that they did.
Yeah.
Well done.
There's hope.
We'll need to put that quote into our show notes.
You got it.
Okay, y'all want me to do weird thoughts because we kind of didn't go very far. So I grew up with Walter Cronkite. I happen to like Scott Pelley. So do we have a modern day Murrow or Cronkite? If we do, who would it be? And would we believe them?
I don't think on their face alone that we should believe them, but I think that we should have several people that we trust to be a jumping off point.
Okay. I can go there. Where? Can AI be considered an objective reporter, or would it inherit bias just like a human?
I think that depends on who created the AI and how it was developed, because we've already seen AI that have a pretty inherent political bias that have been released to the public. I think that's quite apparent. I also think that there are AI that I think you could design one to try and avoid that specifically, but I don't know that that is being implemented to the extent that it could or should be at this point.
Wouldn't it be interesting, though, if you could have AI without bias? What would media look like if they had to wear fact check badges in real life, like Twitter or Facebook labels misinformation? How would that look on your social media? And would you be so quick to reshare that story?
Can you imagine scrolling through somebody's Facebook page, Threads page, Instagram page, and there was just one after another? Lie, 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 missing context. This isn't true. Would you spend any time there?
That's not what that's not what your feed looks like already?
Well, it's not identified.
Yeah.
Fair enough.
I'm thinking literally like a stamp, a badge. Like,
Yeah.
so for a long time on Twitter, before it was X, you could to a point, trust those verification badges, the little blue check mark, right? This really is Kim Kardashian's account. She has verified that this is her. We're all on the same page. This is Kim's account.
You're not thinking about individual posts. You're thinking about
both.
Oh.
I'm thinking about both so now today you can buy your verification check mark. I am who I say I am, or I am paying for this account, whether I am them or not. And if you were able, you guys, Cole, I'm going to go back to that story we talked about, that video that you shared with me. Would you repost that if it came with hey, this isn't accurate, this is a lie, and this is out of context? Probably not.
I may go back and find the full context and see if it carries the same weight.
Sure.
Yeah.
And post that, but
I'm just thinking how much would make it through unmarked.
And how do we even go about doing that? Facebook this year alone has introduced community notes, which has been a thing on some other platforms. But A, how often do you see those? And B, who is putting them in? They're supposed to be for us saying, hey, you can go comment on these things.
Yeah.
But are they really effective?
Yeah. Who has time to go and fact check everyone else's bullshit?
Yeah. And so I don't even know how you would do that if you used AI to run through and say, hey, this is out of context. You guys remember that website Snopes?
Yeah.
I feel like they did such a good job. And it's still around and I still use it on occasion, but it's not nearly as prevalent as I feel like it was at one point in time. But you could literally go through and say, hey, I'm talking about this scam against the elderly with text messages. Tell me about it. Hey, here's the context. Here's what's going on. This is mostly true, but these couple of pieces have been tweaked to create more outrage. This is what it is. And so it has a true, kind of false, totally false, completely debunked. It has those badges that you can check things out on. And so I think it would be so fascinating on things that are posted, especially with news in them, whether you're a news account or a Catly account. If you actually had to own up and hold accountable to whether or not it's true or false, I think it would be a fascinating social experiment.
Yeah, I would love to see that.
Yeah.
Okay, Boo, you got a good news story for me?
Yes, Dr. Z. Let me get back here and find him. So this was an article that I came across earlier this week. There is a doctor, I believe in the Baltimore area, Dr. Z. So Michael Zollicoffer, Dr. Michael Zollicoffer, known to his patients as Dr. Z, has spent about 40 years as a doctor in the lower Baltimore area. And he has kind of had this running thing of, here's his quote, "Forget that dollar bill. I'm going to see you no matter what. You walk in that door, you will be seen. You bring your grandma with you, I'll see her too." He's a doctor that has been seeing patients in the Baltimore area for several decades at this point, regardless of whether they were able to pay or not. And I think that is generous and selfless to a degree that is uncommon these days. And I would very much like to commend Dr. Z for that. But unfortunately, in the recent past, Dr. Z has been diagnosed with cancer. And his treatment was going to be very, very expensive. And unfortunately, like everyone else, Dr. Z is not perfect, and he had a lapse in his insurance coverage. So it was going to cost him out of pocket roughly $150,000 in order for his cancer treatment to be treated. And he didn't have that on hand, probably because he has been seeing patients without pay for so many years. He has not prioritized greed like many other people have done. So when Dr. Z's patients heard about this and figured out what was going on, they started a fundraiser for him to help pay for his cancer treatment, and have raised almost $300,000 to do so far, to make sure that Dr. Z can continue to provide a service and help out his community as generously and as lovingly as he has for the last 40 years. And I think that that's incredible. So I want to commend, first of all, Dr. Z, and we wish you wellness and health, and hope a bright and pleasant future for you. And I also want to commend your community for recognizing how valuable you are as a part of your community, as a piece of your village, and for saying, hey, you've helped us, now let us help you. That's been a motto of mine for a really long time. Take care of people and people will take care of you. And I think it's really, really important to realize that and to prioritize each other over greed. And again, that is within reason. You can't just do everything selflessly because, like you talked about earlier this week, Gig, or one of our shorts that we've posted recently, where it's free to be an asshole, and it's free to be nice. And both of those really do come with a cost, but one of them has a much better benefit down the line than the other one does.
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm not saying let people take advantage of you. That is not what I mean when I say be nice. But when you're nice to people, when you take care of the people around you, the people around you will take care of you.
So thanks, Good News Network, for that story. Well done.
Very cool. I love that.
Yeah. Okay. It's been a rough conversation, but a good conversation.
I don't
Thanks
think
for
it was
having it
rough
with
at
me.
all. I think it's been fantastic. And
I would agree.
And-
I don't know. Callie kind of picked on us.
Man,
well, but I don't think she was unreasonable.
Both.
I
I
love you
love you
guys.
too.